last week, or maybe the week before, the president announced that the money that had been earmarked by Biden or under Biden's presidency to bail out the Intel Corporation would be converted from a grant to do that to a 10% interest. That is, the government would own the shares of the company into which it was pouring an estimated over $9 billion. Intel has had a lot of problems in the recent months and years. Its stock price was down. It was considered in many circles to be a failing corporation. And you know, in the old religion of capitalism, if a capitalist makes mistakes, invests in the wrong place at the wrong time in the wrong product, then the system makes them lose money and they go out of business. And that this is a way of, in a sense, punishing the poor performers and rewarding correspondingly those companies that do better. It was taught that this is the self-healing process of capitalism and that we should welcome it because it removes the less efficient producers and leaves us with the more. So for example, Intel produces chips. Well, they're losing money because Nvidia and AMD and other major corporations are more efficient in producing the better quality, newer chips, etc., etc. Therefore, one would have to conclude that the United States government has taken a position in a failing company, sustaining an inefficient producer, blocking the economy from getting rid of the inefficient producers and leaving the more efficient. It is preserving the relatively less efficient producer, and it is giving the government an investment in a loser. So why would you do that? That doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense. Well, put aside for the moment covering the whole shenanigan over with national security considerations, which nobody in the business takes seriously. Here's the thing, the remarkable thing. The president, to perhaps his credit, wants not only to make a lot of money for himself, but he sees himself as the president of an enterprise likewise focused on making money, which misunderstands what the government has always been. The government has always been the entity that you get to do what the private profit motive is failing to do for you, because the private investors don't want to take the risk, because the private investors have better things to do with their money. So to give you an example, the United States from very long ago set up a postal system. Why do you set up a postal system? It has nothing to do with socialism. It's very practical. You need to be able to move bills being paid, bills being sent from producer to consumer. And the consumers live all over the country. They live in rural areas. How are you going to get the bill to the rural areas or the outlying? You have a post office, and it has a little building, even in a little village, because there's business to be done. Every business in America, from its inception to this moment, has been subsidized by a postal system run either at a loss or barely breaking even. And the reason nobody invested in a postal system was because it was too risky and too low profit. And so we had the government do that. Nowadays, we have an even worse situation. We have companies that figured out if they could carve out a certain part of what the post office does, they could do it and make money off of it. Not the part that subsidizes all of us, that makes it possible for all of us to utilize, I'm going to use names now, Amazon, because it can distribute stuff everywhere in America. No, 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 no. We will have Amazon and FedEx and United Parcel Service. They carve out those areas where you can make money and then leave the post office with all the things that don't. And the only thing crazier than not recognizing that is then turning around and blaming the post office for not being profitable. That's so stupid, it takes your breath away. No, the profits of the post office are not there because they subsidize the profits of everybody else in the system. You should be grateful. But no, you use the ideology because you're scared. Well, what are you scared of? You're scared of the fact that if you actually look at what the post office does, it does the same thing as FedEx and United Parcel Service, but it does it more cheaply. Not more cheaply because the workers aren't inefficient. They're just as efficient in the post office as they are anywhere else. But the post office doesn't have to run a profit, whereas the private companies do, and they jack up the price so they can make the profit, which means they're squeezing you in a way that the post office isn't. And instead of being grateful, the ideology has to turn you against the post office, because otherwise you might begin to understand that what the post office does more cheaply than FedEx or UPS, the government could do more cheaply across the board. Suppose the government had its own automobile factory, or the government had its own computer factories. They could run them without having to earn a profit either, because that's what the governments have done. The same is true with Amtrak. Amtrak doesn't make a lot, or didn't used to make a lot of money. Yeah, that's because it carried people and packages for less money than they would have had to charge to make a profit. But that's a subsidy to everybody else. It's a little bit like a police department in any community. Every storekeeper and every household could hire part-time security agents to give them security. But we don't do that. We collectivize the process to save money. It's more efficient to have a police department, a fire department, a health department, and all those other things, because it's a subsidy to what remains. And now let me give you the ultimate example, because it shows you how dangerous it is to live with the delusion that your job is to make money. The country that has gone very far with this idea, we're going to put together private enterprises driven by profit to get certain things done that seem to be done well in that way. But we're going to understand that there are many, many things in a society that have to be done outside of the profit system, that won't be done if it depends on the profit system, and that are not only necessary for us to consume, but here comes the punchline, they're also necessary because they provide subsidies to the privates. Okay, the country that has gone the furthest with that is the People's Republic of China. They have an economy half private, half public. They understand what Americans used to understand. Do we need the government, for example, to create the conditions for private profit? Yup. You know what we call those institutions that don't make a profit, but that subsidize everybody else? I'm going to give you just two examples from American history. Public schools, that's a big one. Public schools. By the way, we had to fight the stupid capitalists who didn't want there to be public schools. That was a fight in the 19th century in the United States. We didn't always have public schools. That had to be a fight by the working class to get. Why did they want it? They wanted their children to have an education, have a better life. The capitalists were afraid. Oh, you're going to make us pay taxes to give those kids an education. But the answer that far-sighted people gave the capitalists was, you're being stupid because you now spend a lot of money training young people who don't know how to read and write, spending efforts correcting the mistakes they make because they don't know arithmetic, etc. You need us to give them a basic education because it'll save you a ton of money, and that is a subsidy to your profits. Oh, they said, scratching their bald heads. And so we have public education. By the way, all the way up now through university. Let me remind everyone, in the United States today, in case you're deluded, 3/4 of the graduates of college are going to a public school that subsidizes every industry in the country. Above all, the high-tech industries who make the most use, because they don't just hire people who have been educated in public schools. They do more. I remember my time at Yale when I used to discover in the lab, when I worked in the laboratories before I became an economist, sitting right next to my professor in the lab giving me a lecture were representatives of major private corporations who were paying Yale University to have their scientists work close with the professors to pick up useful tips. That's a subsidy. That's a subsidy to the private enterprises. Railroads are another. We built railroads into places where there were no people. Oh, let me take that back. Where there were indigenous people we hadn't killed yet. We built the railroads. Why? Because that would create the conditions for towns and cities to develop across the expanse of the United States. When they eventually made a profit, it was because they had a pre-existing transportation system. I mean, I could go on and on. All of economic development shows us that you need to do all kinds of things in a society that privately are not profitable enough to get the profit motive to get them done. And you need the government to come in and help you. At least that's the way we've done it up until now. And the most rapidly growing economy the world has ever seen is the last 40 years in the People's Republic of China. And that's how they do it. If you want to know what their secret is, no secret at all. They understood the crucial role of the government, not to be motivated by private immediate gain. That's Mr. Trump. He is making money. He tried to solve the war in Ukraine by buying the rare earth minerals off of Mr. Zelensky before the whole thing fell apart. And of course, it didn't work. That's not how you solve a social problem, by making money off of it. You know what that is? That's crazy. And it reminds me of a fairy tale that my parents taught me when I was a little kid. It was about King Midas. King Midas, he was the famous king who thought that the point of life was to accumulate gold. And he had a magic touch. Almost everything he touched turned to gold. It's like a businessman saying, I only go where there's profit. I'm in it for the profit. And then the punchline of the fairy tale. And then one day he touched his daughter, whom he loved dearly. And she immediately turned into a piece of gold, not a human being that he could love and be loved by. And that was a tragedy we were supposed to learn as little children. Mr. Trump, no one ever read him that fairy tale. Or if they did, he was watching television while the story was being relayed. He didn't get it. You don't solve problems that way. Not your own and not your country's either. But that mentality, if it isn't constrained to the limited area where maybe it applies, that's all I'll give it. Maybe it applies. But you miss out on all where it doesn't apply, you will regret it. If private capitalism, unchained, is what made America great, well, then the fact that it's unchanged now is leading us into the decline that everybody now understands we are caught up in. And we're looking across the world at China, not caught in and doing a hell of a lot better.